All right, well, welcome back to part two of the pleasure I'm having of interviewing Pastor Opderbecke about his experience in deciding to run for the state legislature following three long and sounds like wonderful calls as a Lutheran pastor in 3 different states. And last time we were together, we were got up through his decision to run in 2016, his election, and his service in the first term in the legislature on the Criminal Justice Committee. And we talked a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of how it operates. And before we leave that first session, just by way of example, because I agree with an observation you made the first part of our interview, that a lot of people aren't as knowledgeable about the workings of state government and legislature as they are, I think, of the federal government. And so you obviously deal with bills on a number of subjects, and ultimately the biannual budget for the state is something that the House and the Senate both have to approve, and the governor sign as well. Is that right?
Yes, it is. One of the interesting things is in New Hampshire, any bill that is submitted has to be heard. It gets to a committee, and the committee then decides whether to pass it on to the whole House as ought to pass, or whether it decides to basically table it or study it, or whether it passes it on saying not ready for legislation.
So unlike stories we hear about the federal government and other places, bills don't just go get buried and die without seeing the light of day. Okay, interesting.
And consequently, we do have some very strange bills occasionally. We have about, I think the average is about 900 bills a session to look at. So of course, those are assigned then to 20 different committees. So that makes it a little bit more manageable, but not entirely. For instance, I'm on the Criminal Justice Public Safety Committee, and we are responsible for the state prisons, the 2 prisons for men, the one in Berlin and the one in Concord, as well as the state prison for women. And because I'm on the committee, I've toured those prisons, which is
interesting
thing in and of itself. We also are in charge of the state police. And so I've been to the State Police Academy and seen the training that they go through. And we're also in charge of fire prevention, firefighting. And so there's also a state academy for EMS firefighters in Concord. That too is a very, very interesting place. But those are sort of the larger groups that we oversee.
Well, you must be watching current events involving police and fires with some perspectives the rest of us don't have.
Yeah, it's interesting. We passed legislation this past term, before all of this really came to the forefront, on having police themselves, of having a civilian oversight committee, and some of these issues that are being dealt with now throughout the nation, we had already sort of looked at and passed legislation that was, I think, very good legislation in those areas.
Interesting. Well, so that's a broad range of subjects that your Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee dealt with. And then were there any, just coming out of that first session, any particular successes, frustrations, observations you'd like to tell us about?
Well, you know, our committee deals with a variety of things, never to be bored. We deal with marijuana. And certainly the last 4 years, the whole idea of legalizing marijuana in New Hampshire has been pretty central in our committee for the most part. And so we've had hearings of which 200 or 300 people would come out. Anyone is welcome to come out and sit in the gallery at a session, at a House session, or to sit in the gallery at a committee meeting. And in the gallery of the committee meeting, the public is welcome to speak. So
Right.
if you felt strongly about marijuana, one way or the other, you could come and speak.
Huh.
And what's so interesting, again, with all of these laws, is that it's never quite, do you legalize marijuana or not legalize marijuana? It's if you do legalize marijuana, how do you sell it? What's the penalties for this or that? How do you regulate it? Where does the revenue come from and go to? And so everything becomes very, very complex. So, for instance, I have basically voted against the legalization of marijuana with the knowledge that it will be legalized one day in New Hampshire. But
Yeah.
because I felt we did not have a very clear structure to try to regulate the growing of the plant as well as the selling of the plant. So we spent hours and hours on something like that.
Yeah, I will tell you from my limited exposure, my impression is that the New Hampshire legislative process is one of the most open to the public forms anywhere in the country. That your committee meetings are open. Anyone is welcome to attend and sign the list saying they wish to speak, and they'll be heard.
Yes. The only thing that's closed to the public are caucuses.
Right.
The caucus of either the Democrats or the Republicans, or a committee caucus of Republicans or Democrats. Those are closed. But anything that's open, that's passing legislation, is open to the public. That's been one of the difficulties with COVID. And when the State House was closed in March, of how do you hold a committee meeting that's open to the public?
Yeah.
And so we've struggled with that issue.
Yeah.
And still are.
You still are, I'm sure. But in any event, your experiences in the first session, which is the biennium, the regular session, and then the second session of the biennium, they were such that you made a decision to run for re-election.
Right. To run for election in New Hampshire to the State House takes $2. You simply go to your town clerk, city clerk, and you sign some documents, and you pay $2, and your name is on the ballot.
Yeah.
If there are more than one name on the ballot for your party, then there's a primary. And if you're the only one, then you go right on to the election.
Was there any, I'm assuming that as you were working your way through that first session as a freshman representative, you pretty quickly started thinking about, do I wish to do this again?
Yes. Depends on which day you're talking about, of course. One day you may feel, oh, this is very good. And the next day you kind of get discouraged.
So in the summer of 2018, you had to come to a decision.
Right. By June 1st, I think it is.
Yeah.
And I decided, it's just really learning the ropes, so to speak. And so that's the difficulty with a one term, is you really don't understand what's happening. It's like going to high school. It takes you to your sophomore or junior year before you figure out what's going on. And so I did decide to run that second term. I had a different opponent, but was elected.
You have no primary challenge, though, I assume?
In either time, right.
Okay, yeah. A different opponent, though, in the general election.
Right. Again, I'm a young man, and you have opportunities. It was fun when you're standing outside the polling place. You get to know your opponent a little bit that way, and that's enjoyable for the most part.
Yeah.
But again, the topics that we dealt with, I wanted to be on criminal justice. That was the most rewarding part of being a representative, was the committee work. The sessions themselves, you're sitting there with 400 people, and a bill is brought up. A number of bills are brought up on what they call the consent calendar. Those are bills that come out of the committee, basically 20-0 or 19-1 or something like that. So it's very clear that a committee has taken a stance on that bill.
And so that a bill such as that is not then debated on the floor of the House. Just a whole batch of them are adopted in one fell swoop.
Correct. And any legislator can pull a bill off of that consent calendar. So if it was your bill and you really feel passionate about it, and the committee voted 19-1 to not support it, you can always pull it back and say, well, I think it should be supported for these reasons.
And have a chance to address the full body.
Right. And so and in the committee is where it's really debated. You hear experts testify, you hear various state officials testify. There are lobbyists that will come in and testify. For instance, as far as marijuana was concerned, there was a whole pro-marijuana lobby, and they would present papers to our committee saying why we should vote yes for this, and then there was also groups that would say no, you shouldn't vote for it.
Is there, the lobbyist has such a negative connotation generally? Is it all negative, or are lobbyists helpful to the process and understanding the issues and the choices?
In many cases, they're very helpful because they're very knowledgeable about a particular issue. It does help in many cases to have lobbyists from either side of the issue, so you get a kind of a balance. In the Criminal Justice Committee, we don't have many lobbyists. We have some, but not many. And so we're listening more to state officials, the head of the Department of Corrections or the head of the police academy, who are saying how these bills will affect them. But other cases will have a group from the defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, who would be speaking for or against a particular bill.
Yeah. When you don't have, a large paid staff like in Congress or in larger states, you need to gather your information in different ways.
That's right. And the lobbyists are a great help in that way, particularly for our committee, because they would have some background and some knowledge of what's going on in different places and some historical knowledge. And that would be very helpful usually. Yeah.
And so I don't want to forget to ask, your second term in the legislature after you were elected in November of 2018, you were now serving in the majority party. And is that different? I assume it is. And how is that different?
Well, in many cases, your position is going to win. Your party is going to win that particular vote. And so that does make a difference. You try to be fair. One of the difficulties I've found in Concord is that neither party consults the other party as they're creating legislation. Sort of like we're the only ones who understand this, and here it is. This is our bill. This is the way we see things. Instead of really kind of in the creation of a bill, as the bill is written, try to get both sides involved. And I think that's one of the weaknesses. It's certainly a weakness in Washington, and is in Concord as well.
But how is there any, based on your experience, how might that be addressed? Is there? We live in a very difficult partisan time, obviously, and it would be nice if there were ways to make the legislative ideas more bipartisan and have broader support.
The committees are the one area where it seems like there's good communication, or at least better communication. And so once a bill is submitted to a committee, it is the committee's bill. And so you could submit a bill saying, well, we're going to change the yellow stripes on the highways to green stripes. Well, okay, that bill would come to us, but then we debate that and talk about that in the committee. And the committee may come up with the idea, well, really purple stripes would work out better, even though your bill was to make them, orange stripe. And if the committee felt that was the case, we would amend the bill. It's our bill now. It's not your bill any longer. It's our bill. And we would amend it. And that's done fairly cooperatively in most cases. There are some committees, it's always a party vote. It's
I was going to ask you that. Are they often committee party votes?
Especially about, in our committee, any of the gun bills, anything that had to do with guns, it turned out to be pretty straight party votes. But most of the other votes were not. And so we had bills to deal with human trafficking. And we had, for a pastor to sit there as sex workers come in and testify was a rather eye-opening experience.
Oh, I bet it was.
but on those kind of bills, you try to come to a consensus, and usually you could. And again, marijuana was a little bit party-led, but not too much. We have bills on animal cruelty in the committee, and again, you'd come together and you'd kind of talk about what seemed to work out well and what was for the best.
And when you said, I'm sorry, when you said the gun bills were divisive, you mean these were bills relating to, I don't say Second Amendment, that's a federal issue, but the right to have guns, and
more were, like a waiting period to purchase a gun.
Okay.
Or we had what was called the red flag bill, which was to be able to intervene if someone is a danger to themselves, going through a crisis, a mental health crisis, and their family felt that they were a danger to themselves, and they could petition the court to say, so-and-so is, endangering himself or our family or the neighborhood or whatever, and we have guns in the house, would you take the guns? Well, as soon as it became taking guns, it became a gun bill, and which was really too bad, because it would be temporary and so forth. But it became then a real issue about guns rather than about the health or mental health, or intervening to try to help someone so they wouldn't harm themselves or others. The same way with, we had bill about carrying guns on school property. And could you have a gun on school property? And that again became a very much of a Second Amendment. I have a right to carry a gun wherever, and so then whether or not it's on the school property or whether it's helping, safety for school kids or teachers, that gets lost immediately. It's all about the gun itself.
It's a microcosm of the experience on the federal level.
Very, very, very much so.
I don't want to leave.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I'd hope that we would be able to make some inroads on prison. That was one of the reasons I wanted to continue on the committee, was to try to make the prison system a little bit more, I'll say, user-friendly, but for rehabilitation rather than for punishment. And but boy, that's a huge system, and it's very difficult to change the way it's going. We shorten penalties in many cases. I mean, whether you're going to spend 15 years in jail or 25 years in jail, the punishment is the punishment. And now if that person needs to be out of society for the safety of society, that's a different issue. But if it's really a punishment, the state is paying, we are as taxpayers paying $35,000 a year for each prisoner.
So is that what it is now?
They could send them to a pretty good university at $35,000 a year. But that's the reality. So we worked hard on that, but couldn't change as much as I would like.
I want to make sure we leave enough time just to wrap things up a little bit. And by that, I mean, we've already touched on, some thoughts you have about improving the process, making it more bipartisan and maybe more thoughtful in terms of what is good legislation. I know you did not choose to stand for re-election this year. So you served your 2 full terms in the legislature, and I want to be sure I give you a chance to answer this question. Do you suggest this line of service to others? Did you find it ultimately, positive, interesting, rewarding? What would you say to others who are possibly thinking about serving in the legislature?
I think it's a great opportunity. I would encourage anyone who's thinking about that to talk to their state legislator, to talk to me. I think it's very rewarding. It is time consuming. It's the sessions go from January to June, and all of those weeks I was gone 2 days a week, some 3 days, once in a while 4 days a week, so it's pretty difficult.
It's pretty difficult for someone who's working for a living.
Yes, very
serve in the legislature.
they have to be able to control their schedule in a unique way to be able to do that.
Yeah. And so on the whole, you found an experience to be recommended to others.
Yes, it became a little bit more frustrating this second term in the way of the divisiveness between the two parties.
Mhm.
And there's a group in each party that just is very rambunctious, I guess is a good way to put it. Whether
You're
that's
you're being charitable.
Yeah, yes, right. And it's a small group, probably 30 members on either side.
Hmm.
The one group is very identifiable. It calls themselves the Freedom Coalition. And they are just very boisterous and, quite frankly, impolite.
Mhm.
And the other group it gets very riled up by that group and responds in like kind. And so that's very discouraging. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done to try to bring the groups together. And we have a cafeteria in the State House and have their lunch. I always made it a point to try to eat lunch with members of the other party.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
You know, just to not self-segregate, because that's what goes on a lot, is that there's a lot of kind of self-selection where you're only talking to people that think like you do. And I don't think that's a good and healthy
Well,
thing.
breaking bread is an important thing to understanding. And
Yes, yes.
sharing. Yeah. Well, listen, I want to leave time because I suspect those that have been watching have a number of questions to ask about your service or thoughts they have about the legislative process. So I want to leave that time, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate your taking the time to do this, and then hopefully we'll be together live when these two segments are shown at an adult forum. So
Thank you.
much appreciated, and it's
Great.
so good to spend time with you.
Always good,
Okay.
Russ.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.